if I could describe the perfect carp, that would be it.
So this spring I fished a lake that is a real rarity in today's carp fishing scene. It's a 70-acre pit. I'm not going to say where it is, out of respect for the other lads on the syndicate, but it's part of a complex of 3 lakes that is fished by a very small 25-man syndicate, which means it is incredibly quiet. Stock-wise, it's got a little bit of the unknown about it. You know, there are obviously fish that we know about in the lake, but there's a few mysteries out there for sure. For me, I didn't really have any specific targets. You know, there's just some really nice carp in there that I'd love to catch. I did actually fish it a few years ago. I had a ticket in 2019 and 2020, but back then most of my efforts were concentrated on Englefield, so I only dabbled on there, and I did manage to catch a small handful, but I certainly didn't catch all of them. There were loads still left to catch. I dropped my ticket because I knew over the coming years I wasn't going to get a lot of time. I was fishing other lakes, I joined Korda, but I'd always said that it was somewhere one day I'd go back to. And this year, that's where I decided to go. I managed to get my ticket back in the winter, and I plan to do my first trip on the 1st of April. It's always a great, you know, a big lake like that, it's difficult at the best of times. And you know, those big pits, it takes them a long time to warm up. So I've always found that sort of start of April is a good time, you know, to get going. Anything before that, you're going to be wasting a lot of time. It takes a long time for the fish to sort of wake up. And we were lucky this year that at the start of April, we were blessed with some beautiful weather. I say the start of April, it was actually the very last day of March that I turned up. I met Rossiter there for first light. We both got up super early, made the drive down there and got there for when it got light, which I think at that time of the year was about 6 AM. We pulled into one of the sort of main swims at the top end of the lake that gave us a great view down the centre of the pit. And we just sat there for a couple of hours, made a few coffees, just in the hope that we were gonna see something to potentially go on. Unfortunately, we didn't see anything, but I did bump into one of the regulars, Jim Epper. We had a good chat and I gained some valuable information from that chat. Now, one of the sort of unwritten rules on this lake is that if someone's doing a bit of time in an area, they get left to it, which is fair enough. You know, it's a quiet lake, it's a big lake, there's more than enough room for everyone. But it turned out that 3 anglers were already doing time up the top end of the lake, which did come as a little bit of a blow at the time because that is the known spring end. It's the shallowest area of the lake. It's south facing, you know, it's in the lee of all the sort of southwesterly winds. The weed comes up there early, and historically it does most of the spring bites. So straight away, I've got to look elsewhere. So we let that morning period pass by and we took to the boat. The beauty of this lake is you can use boats. So we went out in the boat. It was a beautiful, flat, calm, sunny morning, and we were due to have temperatures of upwards of 20 degrees over the next couple of days, which is exactly the type of weather you want to be turning up for your first trip of the spring on a big lake, in my opinion.
So what I'm looking for is areas of shallow ground. The majority of this pit is relatively deep. I'd say 12 to 15 foot and deeper, but there are areas of shallow water, and by shallow water I mean anything less than 8 foot ideally. Those are your sort of prime spring areas, you know, the areas that are going to warm up first in the sun and the areas that you're likely to intercept them in.
Anyway, we went down the centre of the lake in the boat, and there's a load of buoys and whatnot out in the middle of the lake, so you can't actually fish dead centre of the lake. But just beyond those buoys, out in front of the boat, I clocked a big vortex on the surface. It's about probably 11 in the morning at that point. It had to have been a carp. When I did a bit of time on there in the past, somebody told me, an old boy Stu who did a bit on there, that there was a plateau somewhere out in the middle, fishable from a swim known as Piers's Point. I guess that this fish couldn't have been far from that plateau. So that's where I decided to do my first trip of the spring. In Piers's Point, I went out there and I managed to find this plateau. It was at extreme range, 250, maybe 280 yards, but it actually came up to 5.5 foot deep. And I thought, this is the perfect interception point. You know, it's still early. You know, the fish are still going to be spending time out in the middle of the lake, and that shallow plateau surrounded by deeper water, when those fish are spending a lot of time up in the layers, as I say, to me it sounded like the perfect interception point, almost like a dinner table in the middle of the pond. That first day, I also went and cut out a swim on the motorway bank. Great little swim this, it's like a little cave in the trees. It's a swim that I'd caught them from in June, when I did a bit of time on there years prior. I only caught a couple from there, but when I went over there in June, the fish had already been there. I found a few spots that had been cleaned off. You know, it was obviously an area of the lake that they liked at that time of the year. The swim had totally overgrown. It was only accessible by boat. It had shallow water in front of it. So I had this idea that this swim could come into play at some point. So I thought, while I had the time, I'll get it cleared now. So when it came to it, I could easily fish that swim without having the ag of having to clear it all out. Went back to Piers's Point and I towed all 3 rods out to that plateau, fished bright yellow ones out there, little sprinkling of bait over the top, bit of boilie crumb, bit of sweet corn, you know, just classic spring tactics, bright hook baits, little bit of bait, just something to catch their attention. The first morning of the trip went by pretty quietly, didn't see anything, didn't catch anything. On the second morning of that trip, after Rossiter had gone home, I actually saw a couple show out there at Mega Range, and an hour or so later, I actually had a bite. Now, at first I thought it was a tench. I wound it all the way in, but then when it got close in, under the rod tips, it actually turned out to be a very small carp. Just had a bite on the left-hand rod, picked it up, was convinced it was a tench, wound it all the way in, and I was out there in my waders, and when it popped up, it was actually a little tiny mirror. But unfortunately, my net was caught in these few brambles and that here, and as I was faffing around trying to get it out, it came off. It's not the end of the world, because when I say it was a tiny mirror, it was about £3. But it was a great sign. It showed that there were carp out there. That one wouldn't have been on its own, and it showed that I could catch them from that plateau in the middle of the pond. The following trip, went back, did exactly the same again. Got in Piers's Point, towed them out to the middle. Didn't catch anything, but I did see a couple show again, but more out to the right amongst the boys. Anyway, on the last day of the trip, I went out there for a look, and over the course of the previous week, the clarity of the lake had improved dramatically. I could now see down with the Polaroids on from the boat 12 foot or more. It was like tap water. And when I went out to that plateau, it actually turned out that that shallow area out there was a lot more extensive than I first thought. You had the main plateau and then you had various other humps and bumps out there, but a lot of water that was 7 foot or less. And I saw this really interesting gully between these shallow bits, 7 foot gully, bit of silt in the bottom, bit of weed coming up in it. Just looked like a really sort of interesting, if I was a carp swimming through that shallow bit, I could imagine, you know, they would like to take that route. It just looked like an interesting feature amongst that shallow area. So I decided to bait that gully. Spread a good few kilos of crumb boilies, broken tigers, bit of sweet corn out there. So it's the end of the second trip. I'm just going to bait that spot. This bucket of crumb, salt, and some tigers. And that's what it looks like after the bait's got in. End of the second trip. Returned about 4 or 5 days later, and when I went out there for a look, all that bait had gone. Now, there had been tufties out there the previous trips, so I wasn't convinced it was carp, but I put the rods out there. I I decided to just put 2 rods on that spot. I basically put 2 H blocks out there, put a pop-up on each one. I decided to change one of them to a pink instead of the yellow, and then spread about 1 kilo of bait between the 2 blocks. So I basically had 2 pop-ups on each edge of the bait. The following day, we're due to have some real sort of moody weather rolling. Typical sort of open water conditions in the spring, you'd say. Big south-southeasterly winds. And that's exactly what came the following morning. It was overcast, big winds blowing through. The morning passed by pretty quietly. Didn't see anything out there, but what was interesting is I didn't see any tufties. And I can actually remember thinking, surely if those tufties had been eating that bait that week, that they would be out there now, and they weren't. And then out of the blue, about midday, I think it was 12:30 to be precise, I had a bite on the left hander. Clutches were tight, it was a real savage bite, like, but taking line off a tight clutch. Pick the rod up and it's instantly stripping line off this tight clutch. I'm fishing that far out in the pond that I decided if I was to get a bite out there, rather than risk it potentially kiting right amongst the boys on a long line, I was going to jump straight in the boat and make my way out there and play it on a much shorter line. So that's exactly what I did. Got in the boat, started motoring out there, got to about 100 yards out, and I've noticed the braid is just pointing straight down under the boat, and I could feel this horrible grating sensation. Like, so I'm snagged. I'm snagged on the bottom. I've got as close to it as I could. I can still feel the fish pulling. It's grating through this snag. I've gone downwind from the snag, tried to free it. Gone upwind from the snag, tried to free it. I've gone directly above the snag. I've got the rod by the butt and I'm pushing it right down under the water, trying to free the braid from this snag, but nothing would work. Bear in mind, there's this big south-southeasterly wind blowing up the pit, and I'm battling with the wind, trying to keep the boat in position, but nothing was working. I tried that for 5-10 minutes, and I'd pretty much come to the conclusion that I was gonna have to go back to the bank, get another rod, go out there, fish my line out from beyond the snag, retie it and play it that way. So anyway, I thought I'd have one last go. Push the rod down once more, and by some miracle, it just freed itself. What had actually happened is the fish had kited that far left on such a long line, I think the fish had freed itself. But the fish is now well downwind of me, I'm upwind, the wind's trying to blow me one way up the pit, and the fish is down the other way. So I've used the outboard, put it in reverse, just gently, slowly gone backwards towards the fish, gained a load of line on it, got it on a short line. Eventually, this mirror has just come up in the water. I could see it amongst the waves. I could see it was a long fish, scales on its side. It could only be one of 2 carp. Anyway, managed to get it in the net, first time of asking. I think the wind pretty much blew it into the net. I've looked down in the net and it was this incredible mirror. Well, I'm in the lake with no waders on, which can only mean one thing. I've only gone and caught one. Not just anyone either. Look at that for a carp. That right there is one of, if not the best carp in the lake. I can't flipping believe it. I know I said that I had no specific targets in this lake, but a couple of years ago, Terry Hearn caught this incredible mirror from the lake that I knew was in there years ago, but it's so rare. I only know of one other capture prior to Terry's. It was 37 pound many years before. When I saw Terry with it, that was one of the fish. I looked at that and I thought, oh, I need to go back and catch that carp. So to have it in my net, first bite of the spring, was an unbelievable stroke of luck, to say the least. Anyway, we got it out on the bank and it was literally the most, oh, I know I keep saying it, the most incredible carp. And look at this hook off. Can you see that? Sorry, look at that. That was never coming off. It was 43.5 pounds. This old mirror, I only know of a handful of captures of this fish. Not even a handful, I think I know of 3 captures of that carp in the last 15 years or so. Tiny little mouth on it, dip in the back, big old tail, these big sea scales on its side. Like, lives in this big pit, you know, the perfect example of a carp in my eyes, and the perfect start to the spring.
Look at that for a carp. 43.5 pounds of the most incredible mirror. If you could describe, or if I could describe the perfect carp, that would be it. When I came back to this lake this spring, this here is the carp that I wanted to catch. Out of all the incredible fish in this lake, this was the one. And to have caught it on my very first bite, I cannot believe my luck. What a carp, what a flipping bite.
Hush, now the dawn may be listening.
That is a great carp. Excuse my French. Flipping heck. They don't come round like that every day, do they? What a fish. What a fish. Yes, Rossier. Put it there.
After that, I did one more trip in that swim. Caught a tench, didn't really see a lot. The following week, I turned up to a total change in weather. It was now hot. It was the first real hot spell of the year. We're at the end of April now. So I've decided I need to go out in the boat and have a look. And it was blowing an easterly wind, which was blowing straight into the swim that we'd cut out. I went over there for a look in the boat. As I've approached the swim, I've spooked 2 carp. It's like I mentioned before, it's shallow water in front of that swim. The weed's starting to come up on that shallow ground now. And as I've come over this shallow ground, 2 carp have spooked from under the boat. Because of the ripple, I was on top of them before I saw them and they were gone. But then over to my left, closer to the bank, I saw 2 or 3 more. I thought that's all I needed to see. Went back, got the kit, got over there.
All the kit is loaded in the boat, as I have found them right over there on the motorway bank in front of that swim that I cut out on the first trip.
Now over the next couple of days, I did 3 nights in that swim and they were 3 very frustrating nights fishing. I had fish all over me every day. They were coming close in. You know, I was seeing them up close. They were cruising in front of me. They were sitting in the bait to my right, but I could not catch them. I tried all sorts. I tried little bits of bait amongst the weed. I tried choddies amongst the weed. I tried hinges. You know, I tried all these things on their patrol route. And every day I sat there with confidence when they'd turn up. But the reality is they were turning up about 10:30 in the heat of the sun. They had no intention of feeding. And by the time they drifted off at 3 in the afternoon, they were going elsewhere. And they just weren't there in the night. Following trip, I went back in that swim.
I'm hopeful they will return. On my way in, I dropped the blocks. Where those 2 blocks are, I actually saw a couple, and there's a lovely area there. There's also a lovely area there. But yeah, the fish I saw was sort of in that area and slightly round the corner to the right. So I'm gonna get the boat unloaded, get set up. Great swim this. And we shall see what happens.
And although they weren't in close, the weather had changed. I saw them showing about 100 yards out. Fished out there, got a few liners, no bites. Another blank. But by now we're into May and I've caught them from that swim in June. So I thought to myself, I'm building up to something here. The carp are using this area. If I start baiting a few spots, I can catch them from this swim. I caught them historically in June from that swim. So over the next few weeks, I persisted in that swim, but unfortunately, things went very quiet. I wasn't even seeing them show out in the pond. The bait was sitting there. And before I knew it, the whole of May had passed. Basically, what I found out is the fish had been up the other end and they'd spawned early. And the reason I wasn't seeing them is because they were at the other end of the pit in that shallow end. They'd obviously been using that for a few weeks. I couldn't see that area of the lake from where I was, and they'd eventually spawned up there. It actually transpired that from when I caught that carp in the spring, 6 weeks passed by without a bite. Most of my time was spent in that swim on the motorway bank, and I actually went through the whole of May without a bite. The first May that I can remember that I didn't catch anything, and to be honest, it was pretty soul destroying at times. You know, the thing is, if the ball is in your court, when you've got a rule like that, it is great, but when it's out of your court, you are literally camping. And after all that period, the first opportunity I saw a display of fish one morning towards the end of May, start of June, on the opposite side of the lake, in front of an area of the lake that we know as Pete's Island. Well, it's Pete's Island because Pete Cranston fishes on there. So I've seen these shows, knew I couldn't fish for them. That day I went out in the boat and I found a load of fish down in the cottage bay. These are the first carp I've seen for weeks. Couldn't fish for them because Jim does a bit down in the cottage bay. I was that dejected at that point that I just decided to go home, and I came back. I needed to come back with a different plan. That area I'd been putting time into on the motorway bank just wasn't happening. The reason it wasn't happening is because I sort of had a eureka moment the week before, and I remembered that when I caught them from that swim years before, it was really weedy over there. And that year, for whatever reason, the weed just didn't come up. And weed growth is everything in the summer, especially on them big lakes. If the weed is there, the carp are there. If the weed isn't there, the carp are not there. And the weed just hadn't come up on that side, so I needed a new plan. So I went home, I cooked up a load of bait, came back the following week, checked my spots on the motorway bank just in case. Bait was still there, it was all rotting in fact, boilies were popping up, seagulls were eating them off the surface. That was the final nail in the coffin. So I've gone out to the middle of the pond, and now I'm looking back over that shallow area in the middle, looking for anything that might have been fed on. I'm looking through the scope, thinking at some point they've got across this shallow area, and then I've stuck my head up out the scope, glanced to my left, right in the distance where I launched my boat from, in the mouth of the bay to the right of Piers's Point, I've seen a carp come clean out of the water. I thought that'll flipping do. Wind was pumping in there, so I've gone over there in the boat, pulled into this little swim that I normally launch the boat from. As I've climbed out the boat, another one showed 30 yards out in front of me, then another one. Over the course of the next 10 minutes, I probably saw half a dozen shows 30, 40 yards from the bank. So I've given it an hour or two, got all my kit out, set up like 2 little light leads, little pop-ups, waited for the shows to subside, and I've literally made 2 casts out to where I've seen these fish. Both went out with a nice drop. Catapulted maybe half a kilo of boilies over the top, minimal disturbance, sat back full of confidence. I'm on carp for the first time in weeks. But classic, low stock, big pit fishing, it amounted to nothing. Didn't see anything, didn't catch anything, never had a bleep. Woke up the next morning, didn't see anything out there. So I've actually walked round into the swim next door, Piers's Point, where I started off. And I'm stood in there, and about 6:30, I saw a single carp stick its head out about 70 yards out to the left.
That was a good fish, mate, that just showed. It shifted some water, and they don't like to show on here.
So I thought, right, if I move back in here, back into the point, I can fish out to where I've seen that carp, and I can fish down to the right into the mouth of the bay where I'd seen them the previous day. So that's what I did, moved the kit in there, went out to where I'd seen that show, found a little gravel hump, roughly where I'd seen the fish show, and then I put one back down into the mouth of the bay where I'd been fishing the previous night, where I'd seen them the day before, and I found another spot in front. That night, I woke up to an absolute melter on the left-hand rod. Played this fishing in the dark, got it in the net, 32-pound common.
Oi, oi.
Real old one, lovely old carp, and it was a huge relief to catch that carp after, you know, like I say, 6 weeks of hard fishing and no bites. Finally, things were happening. Thank the flipping Lord. You know, there was an opportunity here, I'd seen carp, and I've got one in the net.
There you go. Epic weather, epic carp. That's what it's all about. Yes.
Following morning, the right hand rod, fished down in the mouth of the bay. The rod had actually been out for 2 days at that point, 48 hours. The right hand rod, 7:30 in the morning, melted off, and I caught a mega 36-pounder. So I've actually now caught 2. I've gone from nothing to catching 2, and 2 is a mega result from this lake.
Well, there he is. A lovely 36 pounds and 2 ounce common, to be precise. But regardless of how big these fish are, just to catch carp from a lake like this is a huge buzz. You know, whatever the size, they do not come easily, and they certainly haven't this year. It really has been a grueler the last few weeks, but
feel like we're on them now, and I cannot wait to get back next week. Just give them a massive bit of bait. Hopefully they're hungry, and hopefully we can get a few more. Oh, thank you, mate. I've got all this bait in the van, so I've gone out there like full of confidence, filled all the spots in, thinking this is it, I'm going to catch them from here now. Big old bait up this week. Feeling it, mate. There was also a lot of weed out there. I mean, some of you might be watching this and be like, well, you might as well have just stayed in Piers's Point. Well, I could have done, but I hadn't seen anything over there for weeks. I was watching that water from the swim I'd been fishing on the motorway bank. They hadn't been there. They'd obviously only just turned up. I didn't know the weed had come up out there, but it had, and the carp were there. Baited these spots, went home, came back 4 days later thinking, I'm going to have them here. Went out in the boat, checked my spots with a scope. All the bait was still there. I thought, for God's sake. But anyway, put rigs on the spots. Had like not exactly full of confidence. There was tiny bits of bait going here and there where fish had probably had a mouthful or something, but on the whole, it was pretty much untouched. Anyway, the following morning, I saw a couple show, but they were much further out. So I actually ended up moving a couple of rods a bit further out into the pond, put one really long, one not so far. And the following morning after that, so the third morning of the trip, I actually caught one. Very small stocky again. Oh. Anyway, that morning I saw a couple show, not quite so far out as what my long rod was. So I decided, I went out to the long rod that had been out there for 2 days on a spot. All the bait was still on it, so I moved that and cut a long story short, did the next night, nothing happened, went out and checked the spots the next morning, and that long rod, the rod that I'd moved the rig off had been cleaned out. I thought, for God's sake, they'd been in, they'd had the bait, I'd moved the rig off it. I was kicking myself. Decided to bait these new longer spots now. What I didn't mention is these last 2 trips, the weather had been classic open water weather. We'd had big southwesterly winds, it'd been quite cool, and they were obviously loving the middle of the pond. But I'd looked at the forecast, and the following week was due to go red hot into the 30s, and I knew they weren't going to be out there, but I'd seen them out there, and I felt like I'd missed a major opportunity getting cleaned out on that spot and not having a rig on it. So I baited the spots, I rushed down there, I got there on the Sunday afternoon to hopefully catch the tail end of that weather before it went red hot and they moved out of the middle. Anyway, I've gone out there, checked the first spot, all the bait's still there. You know, classic, low stock, big pit fishing. I've gone out there with the scope and they are untouched. First spot untouched, second spot untouched. The longest spot went out there totally polished. That was the spot that I'd been cleaned out on the previous trip. Put a rig on it, I was tight for time. Speedboats had been out, like the ski boats had been out that evening, and by the time they went in, the light was fading. I can remember I struggled to get a rig on that spot because it was quite windy, but I managed to get one on it. Put about 1 kilo of bait over the top of it. Did put 2 more rods out, but it was mainly just as a token gesture. Those spots hadn't been touched. It was that long rod that I had all the confidence in. Anyway, woke up the following morning, super keen. Looked out there, sun was out, clear blue skies, never saw a carp. And the previous couple of trips I'd been seeing them, and I thought, I've missed this opportunity here. Anyway, 7:30, out of the blue, I've had a blistering take. I say a blistering take, the clutches are tight, but like this rod has gone out the rest. I say out the rest, it's gone. I've picked the rod up, very similar to that early bite in the spring. You know, to be honest, the spot is not a million miles away from where I caught that mirror from in the spring. Same sort of range, I've had the bite, it's taking line off a tight clutch, I've jumped straight in the boat, made my way out there. Got out there, it's funny, when you go out, when you don't put pressure on a carp and you just wind your way out there, they don't really do a lot. And when I got out there, this fish was only 10 yards away or so from where I actually hooked it. But as soon as I turned the outboard off and put a bit of pressure on this carp, it has just gone mental. It stripped line off me, straight down through the buoys. I mean, there's a 40-yard gap between the buoys, but it's gone straight down through the buoys. And I'm actually thinking, Christ, this fish best not make them buoys. Managed to slow it down. It's come up in the water, it's rolled, I saw the length of it. I thought this is a good one. Anyway, managed to eventually get it to the net. It's rolled on the surface again, big golden common. And anyway, second time of asking.
it's in the net. Look down and it is this mega long common. Like, I cannot, like, I've never seen a carp that sort of deep in colour, like mahogany flanks, golden sort of purples, like, you know, the most incredible long common.
That's a flipping good one, that is. Look at that. Happy June the 16th. Absolutely nailed as well.
Got it back to the bank, weighed it, 42-pounder.
Absolutely nailed as well. Look at that.
The more I looked at it, I thought, I recognise this fish. And it actually transpires that it's a fish that I'd actually caught from the lake 5 years previously at a couple of ounces over 40 pounds. I had it in the night. I had night shots with it, so I never got to see exactly how, you know what it's like in the dark, you never see exactly how impressive these fish are. But on the bank in the sun, it looked amazing, this carp did. I know it's a repeat, but to see it all those years later, you know, looking so good, you know, and to add to it as well, that fish had not seen the bank in those 5 years, and it's only ever done one capture prior to that. So again, a carp that has only seen the bank 3 times in God knows how long, maybe a decade or more. So yeah, actually transpires as well. The mirror that I caught in the spring, although there are definitely a few surprises in this lake, I'm not denying it. The mirror I caught in the spring is actually the biggest known mirror in the lake. The common that I caught at the end of the spring is the biggest known common in the lake. So although it was a bit tough at times, I started the spring off with the biggest known mirror, I ended the spring on the biggest known common, so it didn't turn out too badly in the end.
Look at that. Look at the mouth on it. Not seen many up to that. That is a long carp.
You go as a dream through the faded eve. Some faint memory on a
Well, it's been a tough old spring. There's no doubt about that, but I always believe that as long as you stick at it and keep consistent, it always comes good in the end, as this fish proves. What a carp, what a lake.
things left in the dark.
That's the fucking bollocks.